Rental rate terminology is often confusing. Most landlords will quote on a per square foot basis, either monthly or annual. For example, $5 per square foot per month or $60 per square foot per year. The confusing part is that there are two components to rent: the rent payment and operating expenses. Operating expenses are things that keep the building running. For example, property taxes, maintenance, insurance, janitorial service, landscaping, and management. In some cases, the landlord pays these expenses. In some cases, the tenant pays them, and sometimes they're shared. The terms you see listed at the top of this slide will normally accompany the stated rental rate, and they indicate who pays the operating expenses. For example, a lease rate might be stated as $60 per square foot per year, NNN, which stands for net, 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 and is usually referred to as triple net. In a triple net lease, the tenant pays all of the operating expenses, which means there is an additional charge on top of the $60 per square foot rental rate. You will need to inquire with the landlord or the landlord's broker to find out the amount of that additional charge. If the lease rate is stated as $60 per square foot per year full service, that means there are no additional charges, with one exception that I'll get to in a minute. In a gross, a modified gross, and an industrial gross lease, the operating expenses are shared between tenant and landlord. There are some broad definitions for each of these three terms. However, I think it can create confusion if I explain them because some markets define them differently. The only way to know the breakdown of who pays operating costs is to ask the landlord or the landlord's broker. In all of these leases, the tenant must still pay the increase in annual expenses. This is the exception I mentioned earlier when I was describing a full-service lease. There is such a thing as a true full-service lease in which the landlord pays all the operating expenses and the increases in those expenses. However, it's more common for the tenant to pay them. In some cases, you can negotiate a cap on the expenses that guarantees they won't increase more than a stated amount. A cap usually applies to what are called controllable expenses, for example, janitorial service and landscaping. These are things in which the landlord can control the cost. Conversely, property taxes are not considered a controllable expense, which means if the building is sold and the property taxes go up, that additional cost will be passed on to the tenant. This can present a significant risk if the building has not sold for many years, because it probably means the property taxes are very low relative to current market value, which means if the building were to sell, the taxes would go up significantly, causing the rent to go up. The most important thing to remember when you're comparing the cost of different locations is that you need to make an apples-to-apples comparison of the lease rates. A common mistake that people make is that they'll look at two lease rates that look the same, for example, $2 per square foot triple net and $2 per square foot full service, and they'll think they're the same cost, when in reality they're quite different. The only way to compare these two lease rates is to add all of the pass-through operating expenses in order to equalize it with the full service rent. That is also the case for the three types of gross leases I mentioned. You will need to ask the landlord or the broker for an estimate of these expenses, and you need to make sure you get all of them. Landlords are not always as forthcoming as we would like them to be about disclosing their building expenses. However, you have to get those expenses because that is the only way you can make a true comparison of the different lease rates. You can request a line item cost report that details all the expenses, which is helpful because you not only see the amounts, but you also see how the money is being spent. After you sign the lease, you can audit these expenses to make sure the landlord isn't engaging in any wasteful spending. So if the landlord is buying jet fuel for his new Gulfstream G500 and calling it a management expense that you have to pay for, you can dispute that.